各位，印度军事专家认为现在是一个改变空战规则的结构性变局。针对中国出口远程空对空导弹，以中国霹雳15为代表，正在重新定义空权的竞争，而这对地区的安全、作战的概念与工业的体系都有着深刻的影响。我们先说一下事实链，现代空战不再仅仅是飞机之间的近距犬斗，电传、数据链、被动探测与超远距离制导，把发现、分配的时间窗压缩到几秒到几十秒。霹雳15等长程导弹提出了一个硬问题：当对手能在数百公里之外发射并终端寻得，那你的空中平台如果缺乏等价的探测与中继体系，就等于站在定点把位。换言而之，导弹的眼睛和脑子比单纯的推力更关键。谁掌握了传感器的融合，数据链与末端的导引，谁就更接近掌控空域。从地域的格局看，这一种武器的进展，对印巴乃至印中的关系都造成了新的不稳定因素。在短兵相接的边境或者局部冲突的情境中，远4程导弹能使防空纵深被压缩，迫使双方重新部署战机，改变巡逻的半径，甚至从调整盟友协作方式。更关键的是，这并非单一武器体系的问题，而是一个传感、发射、指控、协同网络的竞赛。有导弹没有传感器，有平台没有数据链，都可能被对方的系统化组合所克服。对于印度空军而言，挑战非常明确，要么就是导弹射程上与对手平起平坐，要么就在探查、预警与多平台协同上取得决定性的优势。这包括了空中预警机、地面海上的雷达网、军载、机载的踪迹，以及能在不暴露自身的情况下提供目标坐标的被动链路。另一方面，国产导弹已推进的技术也是短板补强的方向。但任何单项突破，若不能与传感和指挥控制融合，都难以改变整体的劣势。最后，政策与产业的角度也不可忽视。远程空战的胜负不仅靠采购一批导弹或者战机，而靠国家如何整合工业链、研发体系与国际合作策略。数据共享、联合试验、出口控制与反制手段都将成为国家安全与工业政策的一部分。也就是说，我们面临的是一个从平台为王转向系统为王的转变期。错过跨领域整合的国家，将在下一轮空权竞争中被迫挨打。空战已经被重新定义，我们的任务不是恐慌，而是务实，理清差距，整合资源，改革体制，才能在这一场新型空战竞争中保持战略的主动。让我们看一下视频。
Air warfare has changed dramatically. It's been redefined. We've seen that in Op Sindoor. Pakistan makes all sorts of outlandish claims about PL-15 missiles having knocked off any number of aircraft of the Indian Air Force. But be that as it may, I think we have to accept the fact, and this is the truth, that air-to-air warfare has been redefined by long-range air-to-air missiles. So there is something called the Chinese PL-15. It's believed to be extremely advanced. Somebody I spoke to told me that it's essentially one big flying gas can. But if that is something that gives it the range to get to 250 kilometers plus, then India is in trouble. We are in trouble vis-a-vis Pakistan, and we are in trouble vis-a-vis China, which operates the same missile. And therefore, everything associated with the Rafale, which has a phenomenal missile called the Meteor, is something that goes into a bit of a question. Because if you have longer legs on your air-to-air missile in the context of India and Pakistan, you can position your aircraft well on both sides of the line of control of the international border, fly the missile. Sometimes it may be data linked, sometimes it may not be data linked. It might have a very good seeker of its own, which opens up, and within seconds, even if your own fighter aircraft is more than 150 kilometers on your side, you can be in serious trouble. The reason I'm also discussing this with you, Shiv, today is because no Indian fighter aircraft has any air-to-air missile presently which matches the range potentially of the PL-15. So, for example, the Indian Air Force and all of the pictures that you will see, or 99% of the pictures that you will see of the Tejas, shows the Tejas with 2 air-to-air missiles. That's the R-73 that has a range of 30 kilometers. The PL-15 knocks out targets at 250 kilometers. So therefore, what would a Tejas do when it faces a missile with a range of 250 kilometers? There's the R-77, which is the primary missile of the MiG-29 UPG, right? That has a range of less than 100 kilometers. It's advertised to have a range of more than 100 kilometers. It doesn't quite work that way. We've got the Astra Mark 1 as well. The Astra Mark 1 has a range we believe to be at about 100 kilometers, 110 kilometers. We've got an extraordinary missile called the R-27, which goes on both the MiG-29 upgrade and also on the Su-30. It's got a very high range or long range infrared guided variant, and also a radar guided variant. The IR variant, I believe, actually flies out longer than the one which is guided by radar. That's more. It's robustly more than 100 kilometers. But actually getting a track for an IR missile, flying it out to a range of more than 100 odd kilometers, and then getting a hit, it requires a lot of things to go together all right at the same time. Then, of course, there's the Mika, which is what, apart from the Meteor, one of the primary air-to-air missiles of the Rafale. It is the primary air-to-air missile of the Mirage 2000. Great missile, world-class missile, excellent, superb data links, high no escape zone, NEZ. That's something we'll be talking about. But it only flies out to about 60, 70 kilometers. Now, if you're facing the threat of a PL-15, then you're in trouble. The Meteor missile flies out to 200 odd kilometers. So therefore, it is competitive. And I think in as much as we talk about this, we don't want to get into an absolute number as it is a huge advantage. But a missile which is 200 kilometers versus a missile which is 250 kilometers, it is a difference, significant. But when you fire a missile, it's also on the conditions of the launch, the maneuvering that the air traffic controller or whichever node is involved in designating a target, directing fighters in a particular direction, being in a better position itself, and then launching a missile. You might actually have a very good solution with a missile which flies out to 200 kilometers. So Shiv, bottom line is that the Pakistan Air Force, which during Kargil 1999 didn't have a long range or a beyond visual range missile, is now, it's better than us. And we have to have a missile that flies out to 250 kilometers. It is insane out there. Now, America is deploying variants of surface-to-air missiles out on aircraft like the F-18 to actually get the range against these new threats.
And that was our episode. Nah, I'm kidding. No. Okay. What does India's air-to-air missile arsenal look like? You mentioned some missiles I hadn't even heard of. I'm really being honest with you. You talked about numbers, you talked about ranges. Very, very seriously, this is actually an incredibly important topic. This is not a side topic. We shouldn't be wondering even for a moment why we're talking about air-to-air missiles, because you and I were there during Operation Sindoor, and this was central to perhaps the most important part of that combat vision. So I want to push you a little further about the Meteor and the PL-15, because we do know that both were possibly used in this exchange. Or am I wrong about that?
No, I'm not aware of any information which suggests that the Meteor was actually used. Again, even if it was, it's something which the Indian Air Force would really keep. I should also mention that there is no clear-cut explanation of what weapon systems the Pakistanis use to target our fighter aircraft. Now, the Indian Air Force, the government has said already that, they won't get into numbers, but they have no denial. They aren't denying any losses. But whether it was the PL-15 or it was something else is something that needs to be looked at. But what struck me as being, such as a surface-to-air missile in HQ-9, for example, which is Chinese.
Yeah.
But what struck me as being interesting is that there was, according to social media, and I've seen the picture, of one largely intact PL-15 missile which landed in India.
In Punjab somewhere, yeah.
Guess what's happening to that missile now?
What is happening to that missile?
Well, they would have taken it apart, analyzed each and every component of that, gotten a really good idea of certainly the rocketry in that missile. They would understand about how the fuel flow happens on that. if the seeker, which is gold, is still there, then they'd get a really good idea of the capability of that seeker itself. When does that seeker go into active? When does it open up its own radar, its mini radar? When does it start tracking a target? Is it at a robust range, or does it actually open up in the terminal phase of its flight? These are all things which immediately change the calculus for air forces across the world. We are incredibly close partners with several air forces in the world, which would certainly have said, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We face a common adversary, potentially Chinese air-to-air missiles. And since we are the closest strategic partners, do you not believe that we should also, give us a sense of what exactly it is that you've found or you've detected? This entire part, I'm sort of assuming that I'm correct. This is deep in intel stuff, which no one will tell you about whether we have spoken to anybody or whether we've actually, gone into what exactly is there in the PL-15 missile. I can certainly tell you we most likely have, because that makes common sense. Nothing more than that, nothing less than that. But to the larger point, Shiv, on do Chinese weapons work? And all that social media commentary which comes that ये खिलौने हैं और ये चलते नहीं हैं, and we'll pick it up as a third rate माल है, fourth rate माल है, हम किसी दुकान से उठा के खिलौना जैसे खेलते हैं उसके साथ. That's rubbish. If Indonesia is now going in for the purchase of Chinese J-10 aircraft on the basis potentially of an assessment of how Op Sindoor went, and have preferred it to a second installment of Rafale aircraft, then that's just a small example of how Chinese aircraft are really, they are formidable. And why shouldn't they be formidable? Do we have any reason to doubt the pace at which the Chinese, military industry is growing? I can give you literally dozens of examples: Army, Air Force, Navy.
Where, considering the fact that we know with reasonable certainty, like you just said, that the Meteor wasn't used, we do know that the S-400 was used.
Extensively. That's what we knocked out.
Yeah, that's what mentioned. Only for the sake of clarity, Vishnu, since we are talking about air-to-air missiles, would there have been a reason why the Meteor wasn't used? We didn't need to use it?
It depends entirely on positioning. Now, if in the initial phase of the combat, if there were a large number of missiles coming across from Pakistan, whatever missiles were actually fired, presumably this would have happened on the 7th, shortly after India hit our targets in Bahawalpur and Muridke, we would likely have positioned our aircraft into, safe space and then hunted for an optimal firing solution. After the first Pakistani aircraft was taken out on the 7th itself in the early hours, that's my understanding, and I think it could have been a JF-17.
There are two pieces of wreckage between 2019 and now that are air-to-air missiles. One was the famous AMRAAM, which, our friend Anupam Banerjee, he held up, a spokesperson of the Indian Air Force at the time, famously held up, and it became a picture that was used widely. That was an AIM-120 AMRAAM missile wreckage that was used during the post-Balakot air skirmish. And then now you've got that PL-15 largely intact, unlike the AMRAAM wreckage that we've got now. So these are two principal weapons, Vishnu, that Pakistan has, we know for a fact, fired at Indian Air Force aircraft, right?
There's nothing to suggest, Shiv, that Chinese air-to-air missiles aren't right up there.
No, I completely understand. So my final question to you then would go back to one of the first things you said, which was about the PL-15 and how we will be tearing it apart to look at its rocketry, its seeker, the electronics in it, etc. Which brings me to the Astra right at the end, because the Astra, as we see it, the Mark 1 missile, which is about 100 plus kilometer range, weapon in service as well on some fleets, has proven to be a good system. By all accounts, the Indian Air Force is happy with it. The Indian Navy has it as well. What is your assessment of that weapon? What about the Mark II? When we're tearing apart the PL-15 and looking at its seeker and the other things, assuming that they're intact or in reasonably good condition, how do we compare in those technologies?
I'm not entirely sure about the integration of the Astra Mark I with the MiG-29 at the moment, which is used by the Indian Navy. I would presume it'll get there at some stage. But again, it's a process. It's got an Indian seeker, which is quite advanced. There are different forms of seekers. I won't get into the details of this particular seeker, but it's an evolution of systems which have been sort of developed in-house for a period of time. I'm actually interested in the rocketry a great deal because that's what propels you to those great ranges. It does have a dual pulse rocket motor.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we need to progress towards an Astra Mark III as well. And that's a missile which would be a ramjet powered air-to-air missile, insanely fast, air-breathing, flying out to incredible ranges. And therefore, the larger question is that if air-to-air missiles get so advanced and the seekers get so advanced, aren't fighter aircraft inherently vulnerable? And therefore, aren't missiles winning the battle against fighter aircraft?
Yeah.
This shiv is where stealth aircraft come in.
Yeah.
If you are unable to track an aircraft reliably, if you aren't able to see it reliably, either in the air or on the ground, then you don't, the chances of your being able to hit it is theoretical. If you ask people in the Indian Air Force, and there is a stock answer, they will tell you that we have certain techniques to track stealth aircraft. That's really hard work to do. And whether it actually exists or if it's just theoretical or whether you've had the odd hit on a J-20F flying in Tibet, a radar hit, that's something they'll never tell you about.
Yeah.
But you have to have a 5th generation platform because it's more survivable.
Yeah.
If you don't keep up with the tech curve, you've had it. We are behind the curve right now.
Speaking of the tech curve, we've tested, the solid fuel ducted ramjet technology, looking at that as like high speed, long range, air-to-air missile potentially at some point in time, also a surface-to-air weapon of the same kind. How far behind the curve is that kind of technology? Because, we both agree, Vishnu, completely that capability first can't be about reinventing the wheel for the sake of it. It has to be about capability, and we are fighting wars quite literally, right? Where we need this technology. Where do we stand as far as that is concerned? Because nobody is going to give, people will sell us the missiles.
I think in terms of data link technology and in terms of seeker technology, we should be all right.
Yeah.
But it all has to work together as a system. The entire business of targeting is interesting as well because many of these air-to-air radars don't have the range of the missiles itself. So if you've got an air-to-air missile which sees out to 100-150 kilometers and you are looking to fire a missile which ultimately gets out to 250-300 kilometers, you're going to need an outboard sensor, which means another aircraft. Whether it's a ground radar, whether it's an air radar, which would be an AWACS aircraft, incredible data links, and a very smart form of targeting, right? That entire sensor shooter business is something which is really evolved and is evolving. You can actually fire a missile cold if you've got the coordinates from another aircraft or ground station,
and it feeds off.
And it feeds off that. You aren't exposing yourself by opening up your own radar. You are therefore slower. The enemy realizes all of a sudden from a vector where they didn't expect, or a direction they didn't expect, or a vector they didn't see, there's a missile which is emerging. Your reaction time has gone down. And so the entire business of jamming is going to define, along with missiles, the future of air-to-air warfare. We just have to get there.
Yeah, we don't have time. I mean, I think that's the central point to most of what we discuss here on Control All Defense, because that luxury margin has shrunk dramatically in terms of capability now. Operation Sindoor, it's become a bit of a touchstone, really, hasn't it, Vishnu? Because if anyone needed a live example to prove the point that you've just made about how the elbow room that the Indian industry and complex has to tinker around and figure out how to do this ourselves has shrunk dramatically. It's still an ideal worth pursuing.
Yeah.
For many other reasons, which we've discussed in episode after episode.
Yeah.
Including to do with stealth aircraft, which we'll put in the notes below. But this is something to really think about, and I think air-to-air missiles defines many of the dilemmas that face our Indian Air Force at this point of time.